Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. Thank you for listening to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and I am joined by special guest, David Nemerson. I followed Dave's work online in Instagram and more recently Facebook for quite a while, and he's an avid pocket knife collector as well as other things. And I really wanted to get him on the show to pick his brain a little bit more about what collectors are looking for and ask him about certain aesthetics and things like that, and just like generally allow him to represent a little bit of the collector's market for us. So thanks, Dave. I really appreciate you joining.
My pleasure. Thank you, Aaron.
So you operate Every Dave Carey on Instagram, right? And on Facebook, but I guess Facebook actually has your full name on there, correct?
Yes, it does.
And where I guess it'd probably be best to start with like introducing yourself. Like tell us what you want about your background, where you come from, like what got you into collecting, things like that first, and then we can start getting into some of the more intricate questions I have for you. Okay.
Sounds good. Yeah, I grew up in New York, Long Island. I lived there until I was about 23, and then I moved to South Florida, where I lived for about 10 years. And 5 years ago, moved up to New Hampshire with my wife and daughter. My daughter is turning 9 this summer. Her name's Lita, and my wife Emily. We're a pretty tight crew here. We kind of live in a small town in New Hampshire with a little bit of property, and it's kind of a quiet life. I work in tech, so all of my hobbies are outside of that. And I think that's kind of what got me into a collector mindset over probably like the last 10 years. I wasn't always a collector. In fact, growing up, I was into technology and video games and, building computers and that sort of thing. And I think the more time I spent around technology professionally, the more my interest in sort of mechanical and analog hobbies grew. And that is really what brought me to pocket knives. In fact, when I was it was a birthday was coming up, and I decided I want to treat myself to a pocket knife. I always had Swiss Army knives growing up, and I always thought they were cool, but I hadn't bought one for myself in a long time. So, I kind of started as you do when you're researching a new hobby with Instagram and YouTube videos, and I bought a Benchmade. What do you call it? Anyway, I bought a Benchmade, and it was cool, and I was happy. And at that point, it was sort of already too late. I was already, okay, Spyderco, okay, what else is out there? And similar to most collectors, I kind of kept chasing, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? How can I learn more and more? And eventually, that turned into production slip joints with like Great Eastern Cutlery, and eventually that turned into higher end production knives like Chris Reeves knives, and then custom slip joints was sort of my entry into that space of sort of handmade, hand finished knives, and that was really what ultimately spoke to me. I think for someone who has a broad interest in hobbies, I always really respected people who commit their skills and arguably life at times to one particular thing. That's just not who I am, and I don't think I'll ever be that way. But I have a great admiration for people who do. So being able to collect and enjoy sort of the product of those people's passions and skills and appreciate them is, I think, what really got me hooked. And that's kind of what bleeds into my other hobbies. Things like design aesthetic and fit and finish and choice of materials are the things that get me usually interested in a maker or a product, but getting to see the quality of the work and appreciate the thoughtfulness that goes into them is what ultimately like gets me really excited and sort of opened up the world of like higher end handmade stuff. So yeah, I just have like a deep respect and appreciation for people who put in those 10,000 plus hours, and as someone who just gets to appreciate that stuff and understand at least as much as I can about the effort that goes into that, and the joy of putting one of those pocket knives in my pocket for the day, and enjoying it. It's to me, it's like collecting art. Obviously, there's a function to it. I'm not, afraid to use most of my pocket knives. But I would say the hobby where I get to really use my knives is kitchen knives. So I'm also into like Japanese kitchen knives specifically, and I enjoy cooking. That's a passion of mine. So those are the knives that get used and get sharpened and, you know, get handled the most by me. But I mean, certainly there isn't a day that goes by where I'm not throwing a pocket knife in my pocket for the day.
Yeah, that's super cool. So when it comes to pocket knives specifically, you're in the vein of slip joints, right, or spring knives. Do you collect any lockbacks or do any other, I guess, mechanism collecting addition with that, like switchblades or automatics or things, or like is it primarily slip joints?
I definitely have a couple lockbacks in my collection, and I definitely have some higher end, like modern knives, frame locks, and liner locks, and that sort of thing. Um, but I would say over time, as knives have come and gone, the slip joints are typically the ones that stay. Uh, there's just something about them. I think that's the thing I probably know the most about. They're the makers that I've built the strongest relationships over the years. And in the past, when I've, had to sell some knives, it is usually those that are the last to go. I think in general, too, for me, my hobbies and my taste usually exceeds my budget. So there's a part of the hobby of sort of the buying and selling and trading piece that I actually really enjoy with all my hobbies, arguably just as much as collecting. I love the hunt and, trying to find a good deal and getting to enjoy something that I might not necessarily get to enjoy otherwise. So a part of my approach to collecting is sort of an equity approach, just because I would if I could, buy up every single knife that I fall in love with and not necessarily think about it from, that standpoint. But the reality is I can't. So I've definitely had to keep that in mind as I go. But to be honest, I really enjoy that part of any hobby. I like going to buy a new car. I like, that process. I know some people hate it, but for me, I really always enjoy the negotiation and the hunt.
Yeah. So, do you have like a top list of slip makers that you look for? Is there something whose work is like always on your radar, or how like what's this actual selection process that you go through when you're evaluating makers to invest in for their wares?
Yeah. I think that, over the last probably 6 or 7 years, which is how long I've been seriously collecting handmade slip joints, um, that's been really the joy, getting to find and explore different makers, getting to see them at shows or purchase them or trade for them and understand, what I do like and what I'm drawn to. I think like everybody in the knife community, that it's only a matter of time until you build some relationships with other collectors and other makers, and that starts to influence who you collect. So, at this point in my collecting, I definitely have cooled off pretty substantially. There was a few years where I was buying and selling pretty aggressively and collecting pretty aggressively, really just so that I could experience as much as possible. So I think the dust kind of settled around a few things. Makers that I built relationships with that, I consider friends, wanting to support them. And then I think makers that represent a specific thing that I really enjoy. I try and collect sort of what would be like the quintessential pattern or material from that specific maker. Um, and with slip joints, I definitely lean more towards like traditional makers for the most part. To me, the Tony and Reese bows, um, Don Hanson, Tom Plopper, Ricardo Romano, um, Enrique Pena, some of the sort of pre-production Enrique Pena era knives. To me, that's like the quintessential stuff, and these are all makers who have been really kind to me during my time collecting. Been generous with their time and their conversation, and their work. I think all falls under the umbrella of like top notch fit and finish and execution, and they're all makers that I think are respected by the majority of collectors and other makers. And I think ultimately what draws me to a particular knife, wanting to collect it and keep it, is if it represents that maker. So, you know, for example, for me, like a Tony Bowes back pocket, or Warncliffe Trapper two blade with some stag or bone. What's more quintessential traditional pocket knife than that? Don Hanson. I would want it to have his W2 steel or his Damascus that he creates. Um, Eugene Shadley. I'd want a multi blade. I'm looking over my shoulder at like what's in my collection, and I think they all represent the makers, like as like this is the knife that represents that maker, right? So I think at this point that's like what has stayed in my collection, and that's really what I'm drawn to now. I don't think, to be honest, there's like a lot of makers that I go, oh, if this were to pop up, I would aggressively go after it. I'm pretty satisfied with where my collection is at. I've had, sort of multiple iterations where a lot has come in and a lot has gone, and what has is left have been around now for a while, or at least represent like a cool story or a cool moment in my time collecting.
Sure. So when it comes to material choices, how important is the material choice in addition with the pattern to you? Like, do you have a specific aesthetic where you're like mammoth, stag, Westinghouse, something like that, or is there like are those things that speak to you specifically, or is it kind of just like an amalgamation of all those things when it comes up?
I mean, I definitely have my preference, and for a long time it was vintage or Westinghouse micarta or a bus. Like I love that stuff. Um, I love the history, the sort of Americana to it, and it's just a great handle material. Of course, like the patina that develops and is showcased by the contouring on the handles. Um, and as I'm looking over here, all of my knives right now are some sort of older micarta, with the exception of a pearl five blade knife from Gene Shadley and a mammoth two blade Warncliffe Trapper from Don Hanson. Um, I love micarta. I'm a sucker for it. Um, but I also like those materials, so I thought for me in my collection, it was appropriate to have those represented. I love the way stag looks. I love the way some of these other materials look. I certainly don't take issue with them. I think it's personal preference, and that's just what I lean towards and have sort of grown to know more about, and appreciate uh, appreciate them, especially from the specific makers like this Warncliffe Trapper from Don, which just he uses the old W2 stock and these old mammoth covers, or just it all comes together, and it's just one of those things where the sum of the parts is equal to more than its whole, if I'm saying that correctly. You know what I'm saying? But I also like when a maker is represented in their work. And, if I'm working on a build, one of the first things I'll say is, hey, this is kind of what I have in mind, but I want to give you the creative freedom as the maker to make something you're really excited about and something you're proud of. And I think that's how you end up with something just that much more special and representative.
Do you think well, it's interesting to me to talk to you about your collecting journey, right? Because it seems like so you slowed down. You were very aggressive at first. You slowed down. You kind of pick and choose like the disciples of Christ now. And I'm interested to know is are new makers on your radar at all, or are you really looking for like the established maker that kind of fits into what your collection aesthetic is?
That's a great question. I think with traditional pocket knives and slip joints, like they the the makers that I think will sort of go down as the makers, and I'll just continue to use Tony Bowes as the example for that, just because he has arguably single-handedly like resurrected these patterns and mastered them and shared those patterns with others, and having a knife from him like that's it, right? Like that is the grail, so to speak, of that sort of knife, right? Like if you've gone as deep as you can possibly go learning about custom slip joints, and I use the term slip joint to sort of encompass all, these traditional style knives. Like that's it, that's the one. If you're only gonna have one, if you were gonna come out of collecting and you've had 1,000 knives and you sell them all off, that's what you're gonna have left more than likely. So I think with newer slip joint makers, to be fair, yeah, I guess I don't really dig in as much as maybe keeping my eye on like newer um modern knife makers, because I feel like that's where I appreciate the innovation. I think with traditional knives, I appreciate the tradition and the execution. Um, Whereas with modern knives, I appreciate, okay, someone sort of working a new locking mechanism, or they're getting crazy with inlays, or pivot designs. Like, okay, that can get me excited because with things I haven't seen before. But when it comes to slip joints, like for the most part, I like the traditional stuff. So that's kind of where I look. It's like someone who collects muscle cars from the 60s and 70s. They may go, oh, Ford came out with a new Mustang. Performance numbers are impressive, and it has air conditioned seats and you know CarPlay or whatever, and they can appreciate that, and go, that, okay, that's cool, but that's not what they're gonna buy. And I think that's how I am with traditional knives. Like, I guess I'm a purist. That's not to say I don't have like more modern knife makers that I do appreciate. Like Jared Ogier comes to mind. I think, when it comes to a modern twist on those style of knives, I think he does it well. He makes as good of a slip joint as anybody. And I appreciate, the innovation and creativity that he brings to it. Um, but to me, it's because the quality is still there. There's not a sacrifice in quality to enjoy sort of the modern perspective he puts on it. So I wouldn't say I'm like, I don't want to see new makers or anything like that, and something could jump out. But I wouldn't say I'm actively like following newer slip joint makers Instagrams. Not to say I'm not supporting and cheering for them when I see them pop up in like certain Facebook groups and stuff, but it's not necessarily something I'm going to be pursuing as a collector.
Sure. Well, and I speak personally. So I always got into fixed blades, as many makers do initially, and there's a place and time for making fixed blades, but I wanted a different challenge, right? And so my goal was to get into traditional slip joints, because I grew up with pocket knives, and my grandfather had a pretty decent pocket knife collection. In fact, I don't think there was any male figure in my life that was in like World War II, Vietnam, or something like that that did not use pocket knives regularly around me. And so I was like, well, that's what I want to do. Like, I'm going to pay homage to my grandfather and that experience I had with him, and I'm going to get into them. But I will be honest in saying that, like, it's a tough market to break into as a maker. It's who's interested in collecting things, like what are you making that sells, and so on and so forth. Because like you have in a standard slip joint, for instance, you have probably more time than in a fixed blade, even if you're doing fairly intricate work in a fixed blade. And so, like, with that time investment and everything, you kind of want to be able to make something that sells. And it's pretty difficult market right now, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think back to when I first started exploring custom traditional knives, and I think when someone makes that jump as a knife collector, because I think it's fair to say that, like, for the most part, now there certainly are people, I'm sure, that grew up with case knives, and the next logical step is to explore like handmade or custom traditional knives. But I think for most people that find custom slip joints or even higher end production slip joints, it's because they got into pocket knives, similar to me, where, you know, they got into production knives and they go, oh, it'd be cool to have a slip joint. It'd be cool to have that for a wedding or, if I'm wearing shorts or it's a more formal event or whatever. And then when they pivot to go explore that market, I think you're kind of faced with three things. You're faced with like production slip joints, and that market has grown for sure. Um, the super high end or the well revered makers that have been around forever, and whoever the up and coming makers are. So I think those up and coming makers definitely fill a niche of like these are accessible knives to someone who wants to make that jump from pocket knives to Great Eastern cutlery to a handmade slip joint that isn't that hard to get, or a maker that they can reach out to and get an order in and not wait 5 years or not get responded to in a message. And I think it's hard to get a lot of these guys to make you a knife. Their books are either closed or a ways out. Secondary pricing on them is inaccessible to some people. So I think there's certainly a place for up and coming makers or makers that are making the switch from making fixed blades or frame locks to exploring slip joints. But I think slip joints already probably make up one of the smallest segments of knife collecting as it is. And knife collecting as a whole isn't a huge industry. So it's sort of a niche of a niche, and then a niche of that niche for custom handmade stuff. So
Yeah.
uh, I don't envy your quest to continue to break through or go deeper as a maker in that. I respect it wholeheartedly. There are knife makers that I respect greatly that have really just started making slip joints. An example of that, I guess, would be Michael Quessenberry. We got to meet at Blade Show a couple of years ago. Here is a top of his game, world class knife maker, and he starts making slip joints, right? So there's clearly respect for the style of knife making. I think we know that the effort to make a great slip joint is it's a it's like an honorary thing because like you said, the investment in time, I think, to do it right is definitely more than a lot of other styles of knives for a market that's already very small. So obviously I'm excited when I see Michael Quessenberry make a slip joint, and use his Damascus in that, and use his skills, his finishing skills, and all of the years of expertise, apply it to the thing that I really nerd out on. Like, so I think there's definitely a place for me to like backtrack a little bit and say there are moments where, sure, like I'm excited to see that, or would make that purchase given the opportunity. But I also think to your point, like there's makers who are creating slip joint knives at a that sort of that $500 to $800 price point, as opposed to that 800 plus price point that you can't even get your hands on. And there's certainly people that want that, and they are going to collect yours and others' works because it's going to be how they get access to it, right? And as you and other makers continue to make knives and perfect that craft, then you will have your followers, right, and the people you've built relationships who are going to seek out and order knives from you. So I don't think it's impossible, but like I said, I mean, it's already such a small niche that I definitely respect anyone who decides to take the dive.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting because, as makers, and this is something that's probably not really discussed too much, but makers spend a lot of time trying to figure out what collectors are looking for, right? It's like, there's this kind of Rolodex of like, these are all the collectors in the market, and this one likes Stag, and that one really likes Westinghouse, especially the rare ones, and this one likes these specific models or patterns, right? And you just got to kind of make it and toss it out there and see which one of those collectors actually picks it up, right? But then there's subcategories of that where I've heard some makers talk about, like, in the economy that we're in right now, new makers or up and coming makers in a specific thing, like, slip joints, like I am, have a harder time competing against established makers that are doing full time work, that where you see their stuff all the time because they really have to hustle into this economy. Like, they're full time knife makers. It hurts them if they can't make the bills, right? And so there's all this like conjecture and everything, and that's where I really appreciate talking to you, because at least one segment of collecting you can kind of dispel some of the mysticism, right? But like when you were collecting like really heavy, were you interested in those knife makers that you saw their work all the time and you invested because they would look like they were going to be around for a long time? Or was there any type of like criterion that you picked other than the pattern and the pattern and like the aesthetic and everything, or handle material choice? Was there something specifically about the maker that prompted you to decide like this is the time to buy from them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I like to answer it in two stages. One, you brought up something that's really interesting, which I didn't consider, which is that makers are thinking about creating for the demand. And you say that, and that obviously seems very clear, right? Like you want to create a product that the most people are going to be interested in purchasing it. I don't think I ever thought of that way, because I always sought out knives that were made by makers who had a perspective that I can see in their work, like buying a painting, right? Um, there's a there's a ton of people that are going to go and buy a sign that they see at Home Goods that says "Live, Laugh, Love." Right? There's millions of people that have that sign in their house. So if I'm an artist, do I make a "Live, Laugh, Love" thing and hope that someone wants that for their house, or as an artist, do I create a painting that's a true expression of myself and hope that people feel connected to it? And so I think for me, I seek out someone who's expressing themselves in their work and their commitment to their craft in their knives, and that's what I want to own. I want to own their artwork. Um, so I certainly understand the need to create a product that more people are going to be interested in buying, but I think for long-term success and growth, you want to create the stuff you love making that comes through in your work, and the people are going to be drawn to that. Um, I think the second part of that for me is that I want a knife I want a knife that's made by someone who makes a really good knife, and then I want a knife that has the handle material that I like on a really well-made knife. And I think I heard this topic on one of your previous podcasts, but uh, flashy material is only cool for a second until you realize that what's behind it isn't really of any substance or quality. So I think perfecting your craft from a function standpoint, right? Like, have I made a slip joint that's centered? Have I made a slip joint that's flush? Have I made a slip joint that's symmetrical, where the inlay is well fit, and those things that I look for, um, and then start to uh, embellish it tastefully, either to order or to your own preference. But I think for me, in any hobby or any interest, the things I want to keep and hold on to are the things that are executed really well and ideally represent the maker that made it. Um, if it's a production knife, I want it to be, accurate and well made. If it's a handmade knife, I want as close to that as possible, um, with the sort of that soul of the artist coming through, where you can experience that. You can, to me, I think like Romano is that for me. Like, I pick up one of his knives and like I can see his workshop, you know. I can see the hammers that he made to make this knife, and you can feel it in his work. And That to me is you can't replicate that. That's original to him. And although it's a Lanny's clip with micarta scales and a Federal shield and a hand finished blade, like a thousand other knives out there, it's a Romano and it's a representation of his craft. So I think being true to yourself when you are a maker is the most important thing, and just be as good as you're interested in being. Because there definitely are slip joint makers that I've seen and actually have like reasonable following and accolade, um, because they are bringing their vision to life, but the quality compared to some of the other makers isn't quite there. And those makers are, I've heard them be like, I'm okay with that. Like, this is the knife I make. It's a representation of me. I'm proud of it, and people collect it. I'm not gonna probably collect that. Um, but I think collectors in general want to collect stuff that they feel a connection with, and I think that connection comes from the maker expressing themselves when they create that work.
Those are good answers. Um, so let's talk a little bit about like the slip joint mechanism itself. So there's I've talked to I don't know if you've ever listened to the Catch Bit show. Neil Punchard, Mike and Jason, they run that, and they talk a lot about like historical, traditional, and collecting and replicating that in their work. And there's things that like we talk about like half stops versus the cam tangs, or centered blades, or everything being blacksmithed and cut in and things like and punched in or whatever before the modern era of slip joints were being made. How important is like a half stop to you? Like how important is a centered blade to you? How important is like what type of like characteristics are you looking for specifically in blades, and how does that change your mind about whether you keep something or trade it or whatever?
To me, it's not necessarily what the knife is, it's how it all comes together. So if it doesn't have a half stop, I would like the action on that knife to be very smooth. Um, if it does have a lock back, I want it to lock up tight. Um, Centering matters to me, I guess. I think to me, why I love slip joints is the same reason I love like kitchen knives, and it's the same reason I like, firearms in certain instances, is that on the surface, these are very simple tools. And what I appreciate are people who have perfected those tools over time and tradition. So if a maker is executing either something that's 200 years old and they're doing their version of it, or they're innovating and doing something different and new, that's not what's as important to me as how well they execute on the thing they're trying to do. Um, so if it has a hand rub blade, I want the hand rub to be really parallel and clean, and sort of delete at the plunge grind like nicely. And if it's a belt finish, like I want to see like the parallel lines of the grind on the from the belt. So I think for me, it's less about the spec sheet and more about the execution.
Yeah, and I think that makes total sense to me, right? Because that's something that I mean, there's no blueprint for a knife maker on exactly like what makes the quintessential knife, right? But I think that all of us see it when like in the marketplace. We all see it. Like Tony Bose is a perfect example. And Reese too. I think Reese more so than even Tony. Like if you look at Reese, everything about his aesthetic is something that just pops to me. Like everything is just on point all the time, and whether you're picking one up and coon handing it, or whether you just are looking at pictures of it, it's just everything looks like it's just like a wonderful knife to have. And Tony, did that same thing. But I just think that there are certain elements of the way that Reese executes things that I think is just an evolution of his dad's aesthetic, and you can really tell that he took that to just a different level of meticulousness. Like I think that anybody who knew Tony or learned from him was like, it's right, and this is like the way that I do things, and you can do it your way, but this is the way that I do it. And Reese just took that to just a completely different level, and it's actually something that Tim Robertson and I have talked about it, but there's a small group of makers around the world that are really pushing the aesthetic of traditional slip joints in that way, right? Where everything is just, it's perfect, and it's what you consider like the standards. It's like this there is a slip joint that exists where it's flush in all three positions, that the blade is absolutely centered, that there's no gaps in the shield, that the spring is hidden, that all of the satin finishes or hand rubs is absolutely perfect, the swedges are even, all the yada yada yada. But then you go down through this list, and it's like, really, there's not a lot of makers in the world that can produce a slip joint of that quality and hit it every time. And a lot of these guys, like I've been in some of their shops before, and when you see them make a blade, like they're really thinking about that, and everything that they're doing is purpose driven when they're making something. And I think that's really cool as a knife maker, to see just the level of professionalism that goes into something that really almost seems kind of like arcane and mystical,
Yeah, and that, I think you nailed it. For me, that's what it is. It's like these things do not need to be that perfect at all whatsoever. Like there are $40 knives that are going to work just as good as any of those knives you described, right? And that's not what it's about for me. For me, it is that I can have the pleasure of enjoying and admiring and carrying something that is flawless for no other reason other than someone decided to put in the extra 10,000 hours to get from a 95% knife to a 100% flawless knife. And it's not necessary, and it doesn't matter from any functional standpoint, right? And it is just, at that point, it is art. I don't think there's really any other way to describe it, because there is no functional benefit to any of those things you spoke about, right? A knife doesn't need a shield. A knife doesn't need a symmetrical swedge. I mean, maybe that's going to help with cutting performance. Like, no one would ever be able to tell the difference if the blade's sharp. But the fact that for, you know, $1,000, you can have the absolute best of something in the entire world, that really excites me as a collector whose budget is not crazy. That I can say, like, I have handled the highest highest level of execution of this particular thing that exists. And I think that's why when we were talking about like new makers and that sort of thing, like, sure, there's things that I see, I go, oh, that looks cool. I like what they did with that, this and that. But for me, like at this point, the stuff that I'm keeping either has emotional component to it, um, or it is flawless. And I can't really think of a lot of other hobbies where you can have a handmade from raw material made by one person from start to finish, the best in the world at that price point, right? You watches and cars and guns and things that people collect, to get to handmade perfection is can be anywhere between 10 and 1,000 times that number to get to even think about collecting that stuff. And for me to feel like, I don't know, just forever feel like so appreciative and fortunate to have like kind of found this hobby and to be in a position personally that I can enjoy those things. That's what I love. That's what I love about collecting, is that like that chasing of perfection. And I think as I kind of went through the years and experienced new knives and new knife makers, and when I would come across these knives that were perfect, it was just like, wow, this is it. And that's just what gets me really excited.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, because I mean, if you think about like a Rolex, you you have the time, like, you know that it's the time is being put into it. You know that, like, I mean, it keeps time, sure, like, whatever, but the time keeping component of a Rolex is like the least of its things. And but you know, you're spending like 10, 15, $25,000, like, and up, in order to get that thing. And to me, that's like a, I know doctors and lawyers and things like that have them, but it's very difficult for somebody like me who's like used to like Timex and Seiko and stuff like that to like think about owning a Rolex, and like I would never take it anywhere. But like I agree, the custom knife maker, it's a very obtainable level of mastery, from a cost perspective, and that's where I think, it gets difficult, because you know, you think about some of these older, slip joint makers like Bobby Toole and, John Lloyd, and people like that produce a really exceptional slip joint with like the materials and everything like that. Like, we're talking about materials and everything, so like you can obtain it for around the same price as an up and coming slip joint maker. Like, if you think, like Lloyd, you know, you can get mammoth ivory and bolsters and everything like that on it for under $600, and it's like, it's hard for somebody like, you know, me to compete on that, because I have all the, like, I'm paying new prices for mammoth, or I'm paying, new prices for certain types of Damascus or things like that, and not much reputation when it comes to producing those things. And it is hard to compete against some of those guys. So, like, to your point, like, you can have a really good slip joint for fairly cheap, and it kind of further complicates new knife makers getting into it, because I don't know if, I mean, it's really hard to hit your stride, when there is that financial dynamic along with, quality and materials and everything.
Yeah, I respect it and don't envy it. Like the gap between a production slip joint and the best of the in the world is $1,000, right? And those guys that you mentioned are, sort of in the middle of that, and they've been around for a while and they're accessible. So for someone who's trying to break into that market, they either have to do something that makes them stand out, whatever that innovation or creativity or new perspective is, or they have to get really good at being really good really quickly, right? Like you have to make a better knife than those guys at or around that price point and create enough demand that you can sustain that. I think like Richie, you mentioned him, Jason, like I think he's a great example, right? Like relatively new slip joint maker. To me, from the outside looking in, here's somebody who understands like what that perfect slip joint can be. In each knife that he makes, you can see him getting closer to it. He puts up knives for sale via first come first serve or lotto, and there's people that are interested in buying them every single time. I never see a knife sit, um, and I think he's going to be able to sustain. And he is what I think he's done is he's. It looks to me like he's making a really good slip joint early on. So if he's able to produce that quality with this relatively short amount of tenure, that's someone that I'm going to keep my eye on, right? Because if this is where he's at after, I don't know how long he's been making knives, it can't be more than at least a couple of years from my perspective. And if you feel free to correct me if you know better, but where will he be in another 5 years? Where will he be in 10 years? I think that's somebody who will probably be creating that level of execution like we were talking about earlier. But he hasn't really done anything different, right? He's making traditional patterns that sort of every knife maker makes using relatively traditional materials. But I'm following him because I see the quality that he's producing now, So I think you can do it. And obviously my opinion on this stuff just kind of represents my opinion and what I like and what I like to collect. I don't know if I really represent the masses when it comes to knife collecting in general. I think maybe more so aligned with specifically slip joint makers. But I feel like, the the number of people that seriously collect handmade traditional knives, I mean, it can't be more than 1,000 people in the world, So it's like I said, I don't envy you, but I respect you for it because you appreciate it and you respect the tradition of it, and you appreciate the skill and commitment to create that product. And I think anyone who's truly committed to doing that and creating their best work of something they're passionate about, there's going to be people who are going to collect it. Um, so I, I, I definitely don't want anyone who's listening or you to feel like don't get into custom slip joint making. Like, yes, do get into custom slip joint making. Like, I there are people who are buying these knives. I think just the reality of it is those sort of issues that we talked about, like the gap between like an entry level and a totally high end level, um, the relative accessibility of some of the middle tier makers, uh, and sort of this rough spot between, do I innovate in this space or do I try and execute in sort of the most traditional sense, you know? Um, but I think if a maker is sort of following their passion and creating the knives that they would want to carry themselves, um, and their sort of blood, sweat, and tears are going into that, there's gonna be appeal.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, I think that there's several different types of collectors out there too. Like, uh, I would kind of deem you like the curator type, right? So you have a specific aesthetic. You collect a very a very specific type of slip joint, right, from very specific type of makers, and then maybe you have like this the supportive like a up and coming collector where it's like I'm interested in who you are. I want to spend a few $100s every once in a while on something that I kind of like, to just get you to the next paycheck or get you to the next project, to that way like I can invest in nurturing you, right? And then there's ones that like are the collectors that look at it purely from a profit perspective, right? Because like one thing that I've always appreciated about Tony Bose is that up until really near the end of his life, his prices were pretty fair and static, right? And then the secondary market was really where you saw those crazy numbers. And so, like, he made a really good quality slip joint for a fair price and an accessible price. And as long as you could wait and everything, then you got it. And then you instantaneously had equity in that knife. So you could go and sell it for probably almost twice what he charged you for it. And the secondary market fed the constant interest in his blades too, along with just Tony and who he is and how he's innovating. But I think that you have a lot of different types of collectors, and you have a lot of different types of money making and investment and everything like that. Because I mean, nobody needs 500 slip joints, right? And even inside of the broad spectrum of makers, it's hard to find a lot of individuality from piece to piece, or like things like that. But I think that if you look at all the different personas of collecting, that it's a lot easier to kind of break that apart and say that there are certain types of collectors for every type of maker out there, except for the ones that can't cut it or make like subpar work, which I think is there's a point in time when you can't really expect it if you're doing like basic execution on stuff, that you're going to build a collector market the same way, or appeal at the same way that you are if you really spend the time and energy to like build like actually execute knives well first, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense, and I think that's like across any interest in any material goods. I think you have people that like are are chasing perfection. That's what they're after, and whether that's cars, knives, watches, whatever. And then you have people who are interested in those items because they're interested in those items, right? And that difference between an 80% flawless knife and a 100% flawless knife is of no interest to them or appreciation to them. And that's fine too. Um, and then there's people who are like, yep, I carry my knife because I use my knife 20 times a day, and I beat the crap out of it, and I have a bunch of knives because I think they're cool, but like, they're a tool and a tool only for me. And like, I would advocate for like right on. Who I think there's sometimes so much shade like amongst collectors. I think about like, Chevy versus Ford and like, dude, you're a car guy, you're a car guy. Like your taste is different, but you both actually share the same hobby and the same passion and you derive, excitement from that hobby. I don't think it's any different. Like if someone likes a knife maker who's producing work that is flawed, but they've built a community or a fellowship and people want to support them and collect their stuff, like good for them. Like that's I'm not necessarily gonna be someone who's gonna support and collect your work, right? Um, but I'm not also gonna take issue with somebody that does. Like, I think the amount of money you have to spend on a hobby and your taste or what it gets you excited about that hobby certainly do not align inherently. So collect what you like to collect. I think this is such a small community, and I think if you're someone who's crazy about pocket knives and you love collecting pocket knives, and for whatever reason, like I think there's there's only a benefit to sort of support that, right? And look for opportunities to educate somebody if they don't see that, but also be okay if they don't care about that too. There's definitely been times throughout my history of collecting where, like, you know, I've caught shade about a particular material or supporting a particular maker, and I think like I might have missed something, so educate me. But also, if I say like, no, this is what I like and this is what I'm collecting, then like at least respect my right to do that. And so you're right. Like I am a curator of stuff. I consider myself an appreciator, sort of an active observer. That's why I love to take photos of my knives. That's why I like to show them off. If people reach out to me and have questions, I try and answer them to the best of my ability. But I'm also not an expert about slip joint mechanisms, right? I'm always still learning that stuff, and my interest sort of lies at the level of which it lies. And I, I don't know. I think it's such a unique hobby, and I, I don't know. I would just encourage people to explore it and collect what makes them feel comfortable. I think when you start to collect beyond your means and you're making sacrifices for your collection, that's not healthy. I certainly have had those moments where I'm like spending way too much time and way too much money in the hobby, and it took away from my enjoyment of it. And that's, I think, why I'm at such a good place now, is that my collection sort of represents like the stuff that means a lot to me that I feel comfortable keeping. Um, and it should just bring you joy. Your hobby should just bring you joy, right? And they should bring you maybe some friends along the way. And that's what's so cool about it.
Yeah. When I think, as a maker, I like there's every knife should be utilitarian, right? Like it should be able to be used. But I really don't. I'm not interested in just making a knife to make a knife. I think that everybody like can just make knives to make knives. But what I really actually do like is the relationship that you form with people that are interested in your work. Not even necessarily because I want somebody to curate me as like this odd duck or whatever, but just because I like actually having friends that are interested in the same things that I am, which is knives.
Mm-hmm.
Like you and I can talk about like I mean, your collection is amazing. Like all of your pictures, I'm like, man, like if I could like switch lives with you just for long enough to be able to like open them all up and just look at them and everything, I think that's really cool. So like, there's an admiration there for like collectors and whatnot that I, as a maker and who's as somebody who has collected in the past, I really just appreciate that. Like I don't know what actually other than I was hunting and I needed a set of knives because I was sick of having to sharpen them all the time. I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to make my own. And then this has turned into like a really expensive hobby on my side to be a maker, right? Whereas I could have just went and bought them from somebody. And maybe I should have gone down that route because I would have had a pretty impressive collection by now with the same money that I've spent on tools and everything. But yeah, I like the relationship. Like as a maker, I would prefer the relationship. I want to be able to make things for people who I know that appreciate them and who are just like spurred on by it. So like it's difficult because like I don't really want to make knives that sell well, in the sense that I don't want to just like kind of pick apart the market and figure out, well, if I use this kind of fat carbon, if I use this kind of Damascus, are those the things that are going to sell? I really just want to be able to get into like a vein always with my blades where I know that they're going into good hands and I know that somebody's enjoying them, and I would love to be able to see that story unfold with like the way that they use them and whatnot. That's where my life energy is actually invested in people, and that's what interests me. Like that's why I make knives, is because I want my life energy to mean something to somebody else, and in their hands it becomes their own story.
That reminds me of this really kind of aha moment that I had as a collector, because I think as a collector, and first of all, thank you. I appreciate like all the kind words about, my collection. You're welcome to come and fondle my knives anytime, sir. But as a collector who, like I said, when we started, that like here's you committed your life to this craft, right? That is like anything that's handmade and made in a shop like yours is like, hopefully continues to have like a renaissance and people continue to have an interest in like investing and doing that type of work, right? As opposed to it just getting replaced with automation and technology and all of that. Like, first of all, I just have that admiration for people who do that, period. Um, but as a collector, it's like, wow, you made this knife, like you're a knife making rock star. Like meeting, you meet a knife maker that you've collected and you finally get to meet him and you're smiling ear to ear and just, oh my God, I love your knives, and I appreciate, everything you do to make them. And I love collecting them, and you're kind of like just obsessed. And so I was sort of having that moment, and I was talking to Michael Raymond, and he goes, I can't make knives if it isn't for collectors. And I was like, what do you mean? He's like, if you're not willing to buy my knife for X amount of money, I can't make this knife. I can't spend, you know, X number of days or even months to make a knife at this level of execution if I don't know that I can sell it. And I was like, oh, that's crazy. I never thought of it that way. But like, yeah, that mutual uh that ecosystem, or that, you know, mutually beneficial relationship is really cool, right? And those are the moments where I've met some of these makers at shows or whatever, and I'm smiling because I'm meeting you, but they're smiling because they're meeting me, and like that always surprises me, because I'm just a customer of yours in my mind. But when I had that aha moment, and you said it really eloquently, like that really is so cool. And I think that's, those are the things that keep you in a hobby and keep you collecting, and maybe will cause you to buy that second, third, or fourth knife from a maker when you might already have the one that represents their
Yeah.
artwork. Um, like everything, right? Like we want to have that connection, and uh, I think my respect for someone who puts that amount of time into perfecting a craft uh, is special to me, and it's cool to hear from a maker's perspective that's sort of reciprocated.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, everybody would love to just have a few honest collectors to be able to feed them and the energy. But like I'll use this for instance. I've always had a full time job. I work in cybersecurity, and I've several jobs sometimes at a time, depending on whether I'm doing contract work or whatever. And in 2020, I was working in this place and I got laid off unexpectedly. And it was like right before the pandemic. And I had been doing knives as a hobby, but I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'm a full time knife maker while I'm trying to like sit on an unemployment and find some other type of full time work again. And I can remember, man, the support, like you don't see it. Like you don't see people like makers like me like crying over like the stress of life and the I don't know, you being down on stuff. But anytime I get an order, and anytime I'd be able to fill it, anytime I would be able to talk to somebody who was interested, it spurred me on, because I was sitting in a really low place because I was laid off. Right, I was like, I either sink or swim, and I'm going to try to swim with my knives, but I don't know if collectors and buyers really understand sometimes just how integral that money is, because really at the end of the day, sometimes for people like me, it can be the difference of whether you default on your car or your house or whatever. It's just, $500 extra it's a lot, right? I don't think any of us makers are so conceited that we don't realize that a collector spending hard-earned money is an easy decision for them. But in a lot of cases in my life, in my experience with knives and everything, there's been times when it's been the difference between feast or famine. And that's something that I really appreciate too. Is like what, and I don't know that any of us talk about it enough. Is sometimes it's you get down as a person, or you get under your luck or whatever, and the difference between a collector or somebody who wants to buy your knives and support you or not can be the difference between whether you can go on the next day or not. I appreciate the community. There's been a lot of times when it's really come through for me, and times when I didn't know exactly how I was going to make it happen.
I mean, I like, of course, respect that vulnerability, and like I said, like, I don't envy that, but I respect you for it, and I respect makers for it, and I think that's like the plight of any artist or maker, is that you you're putting in, tens of hours into making one knife, and that's just a knife that's sitting on your workbench really until, someone decides to buy it, right? Um, yeah, it's a trip, and like, there are you and a number of makers that, like, sure, of course, like, you want to be able to buy and there are certainly collectors that, like, they meet a maker, they want to support them, they're going to invest in them early, and is that for the hopes that they get big and they are sitting on a fat collection, or they just really see something in that person and they want to encourage them? I think people have a million different reasons to support a maker. Um, but I would just encourage anyone who's like dipping their toe in collecting these types of knives to, like, take the time to experience them. It's a safe thing to collect. You're never going to really be on the wrong side of one of these knives. I mean, the worst case scenario, you lose $100. Um, and the differences between 10 different knife makers making the same exact Lanny's clip with bolsters and micarta with a Federal shield, each one of those 10 knives is going to feel completely different. And that representation of the person who's making it, to me, is like, that's the stuff that I really enjoy. And I think that's why I needed to own and buy and sell as many knives as I could, so that I could experience that and see what were the things that really spoke to me. And I've just been, like, so surprised at times by a knife that isn't, by a famous knife maker, that brought me, infinite as much joy as the fanciest of knives. I mean, I bought a $40 like Klaus uh Congress knife class. One of these guys.
Yeah.
It's like not that old.
Mm-hmm.
It's got plastic handles. It's got 4 blades, but, like, it's good. And I bought it on eBay for like $35, and when it came, I was like, "This is awesome." I'm, like, just as excited to check this out as I was, a knife that costs 10 times as much. And I think when you can experience an artist's work at a relatively, like, affordable, I mean, whatever that's relevant to whoever's spending their money, but I would encourage people to go and explore and try different makers and see what that knife is like for you, because it might be the one that you're like, holy smokes, I love this maker and I want to collect more of their knives.
Yeah. Well, you kind of answered my last question. So usually, as a burn down to the end of an episode, I ask like about advice. If you have advice for new makers or collectors or things like that. But I think you just encapsulated that pretty succinctly. So like, I really appreciate your time. I think that sea of collectors that want to have safe queens and hide that stuff away. And it's like, these are like, I won't disclose numbers. I won't disclose like how much I paid for things. I won't disclose what those things are. You and a subset of other collectors, especially in the slip joint market, have just kind of like opened the floodgates. It's like, this is what I collect. I'm going to take pictures, like real good pictures. And I'm just going to be out there and kind of expose or lift the veil of collecting. And I really hope that that trend continues, because I like to see when people collect my knives. And you'd be surprised on how few of my knives actually get actively out there and pictures taken of them, even for the number that I've made. I really like I really like collectors and users who love to be able to show off their work, because like equally, it's not a notoriety thing. It's the pride in that they're proud of it and that they want to use it and show it off. So I really appreciate all the effort that you put into beautiful pictures and interacting with makers and other people and whatnot, because that investment, I think, is important in the next phase of knife makers. We're seeing it as a different era of knives, and I think that you're on the forefront of being able to support that and encourage other people as well. So I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. That's very kind. I appreciate you reaching out to me to, get to connect a little bit, and it's nice to meet you and see you and chat, and your efforts and your commitment to creating knives and the time that it takes to put into a podcast, and it is appreciated just as much on this end. And I I would say to makers, make easy for me to say. I understand that, but I think if you want to be a maker and you want to find success from a financial standpoint, you have to go all in and you have to represent yourself and your best work. And that's obviously so easy for me to say, but I do think that's the reality. And, when I first started seeing your knives, it was like the little fixed blades you were doing, like the little bird and trout knives. And those to me, like they jumped off the page. I thought they were unique to you. And anytime I saw them, I knew they were yours. Um, and for collectors, collect what you like to collect. Don't be closed-minded. Learn, research what you want, but also if something makes you happy, it's your money, collect it, enjoy it. And I think the more that we can kind of respect that amongst collectors, the healthier the community is, and the healthier the community is, the more people will be involved in the community, and the more people that are involved in the community can support more makers to continue making. So I appreciate everything you're doing. I appreciate your vulnerability, and for having me on to talk. It was really a pleasure. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time, and you have a good night, okay?
All right, you too, bro.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.